How well do you know the Cathedral of the Deep? So if you think a Cathedral of the Deep, you're probably thinking, oh, that place where enemies were absolutely atrocious and we have the invasion covenant and people would explode. But let me tell you a little bit more about what this place truly represents that you might otherwise have missed. It's quite likely these more common sort of graves infesting this sort of grave area are either those sacrificed to Aldrich, or they are to those more sworn and dedicated to the Cathedral of the Deep in general. Whichever the case, there is one sort of consistency we can notice to conclude what the others are for, and that is in the peculiar sense that there is quite fewer of this other type of grave. Now, which grave am I talking about? I am talking about these ones. These more specially secluded and more unlike ones that otherwise do not match the other ones at all, and therefore are more likely of significance to those who run this establishment. As an establishment regarded off its original purposes based on being the way of the light of holy magic and such, of miracles, we do see these sort of hinting cluiness into the nature of it with these sort of angelic sorts. However, don't be fooled, for it is actually some way in representing of the people here also, of their traditions, their cultures, and beliefs, as it is also like body morphed to have flesh more disfigured out of its regular shapes, sizes, and proportionalities, such as this sort of back flap here going over his head. But besides that, let's move on. One fine example of an interesting sort of entity we happen to come across here at the Cathedral of the Deep is none other than an onion. Well, two onions. One's actually not an onion, and the other was... Well, I guess when we found them, they weren't an onion either. But, we make it right, technically. And so one returns to their glory as an onion, and the other just sort of puts their onion aside for a while. But this first onion here would happen to be Patches. Now, Patches, he hates clerics. He despises clerics. And yet we find him roaming around this place built by people of faith. Very peculiar detail indeed. And not only that, we would find him pretty much holding a basic sort of security line that goes to that of none other than Rosaria's bedchamber. Why that might be is an interesting one. Is he actually on guard to Rosaria? Is he in some kind of connections with the fingers of Rosaria, like that of Longfinger Kirk, of Yellowfinger Heysel, or of Ringfinger Leonhardt? That's not quite too well spoken, but what we can entrust is that he simply hadn't been as affected by these always ready to invade group of people. Or at the very least, if he had been, he simply had the jump on them. He had the upper hand. But the reason I think it's more likely he was on very good terms with them is that he was not threatened at all by these grub men, by this cleric one. He also didn't care to go after them at all. As for why is a peculiar question. Why would someone who literally brought a trap down to try to feed us to a giant, as well as sending another sort of cleric, like priestess, to a giant, as well as a drang warrior? Well, your guess is probably as good as mine on that one. But the cleric, I'm sure he just straight up despises clerics. Something to note about these people here of the Cathedral of the Deep is that they were considered no longer that of holier practices and responsibilities to some extent, as many of them would be seen no longer using their tools of holier practice. They put them aside. But let's talk a bit more about these other sorts of entities here. The Fingers of Rosaria. So over here is Rosaria's bedchamber. This entity, Rosaria, she is a goddess of rebirth. And her followers will invade others to take their tongues to give to her, as she was stripped of hers from one of her own, more than likely a child or something, in which case it very well could have been like Aldrich perhaps, as it is kind of assumed that they are of that kind of connection of relationships. But yes, Rosaria is that of rebirth. Let's take a quick look around what is her bedchamber. Now, you see there is an interesting selection of decor. Particularly all these cradles. And of an interesting size. Now, the size could mean anything, to be honest, so I'm not going to nitpick on that too much. But I do think, now this is more so of just a straight up hypothesis, that it was used to sort of do sort of experiments to make more infantile of servant creatures to some kind of cause. And more so, I think that could be related to the wretches of, they're called wretches, by the way, in the Irithyll dungeon, where they have like a giant infantile head and screech horrifically and cast like sorcery. I think they're of some kind of connections to Osiris of the Lothric Castle's garden down below. Which makes actually quite a bit of a sense, to be honest. But the more we go around the game and pay attention, the more we find sort of notable details that entwine the Cathedral of the Deep to other areas. For example, we do find actually one of these grub men at Lothric Castle's Grand Archives. This grubman is beneath the cage that contained Gertrude, who worshipped the angels. It in turn was also taught one or two of their divine spells. It was suggested that angels and also Gertrude herself were experimented on as part of the punishment, but was never too clarified what this sort of experiment process was, or how it could have worked. But the fact that there was, in fact, a grubman underneath the cage holds some interesting implications of what could be the truer, horrible nature of this process, especially if you recognize the fact that the grubmen connect to a goddess of rebirth, of changing physical fleshy formation. Yeah, you can probably imagine how bad that can really be. But let's get back to what is of the fingers of Rosaria. And this is actually an interesting topic for me. Also, before I get too lost on the topic and have to clear out all this mess again, this area is literally painted with blood. Blood and guts of those sort of brought here. And this is actually a subtle detail that makes another sort of detail of sense, that enemies here of this sort of deep nature are actually quite vulnerable to being essentially stabbed. Which is a very subtle weakness that is often easily overlooked. But this pathway here is actually the main pathway with the main front door to the cathedral. This is the door Aldrich would have taken, more than likely. If he came home, he would have come through here, come this way, say hello to his mother. He could have come this way and go down an elevator that would have fit him enough in an awkward sort of way, as it wasn't really customed for his continuous growth, and all the way to his sort of coffin room, where he just sort of rested inside of. As the deacons all sat down there. First, let's talk about Longfinger Kirk, the Thorned Knight. We know of him as far back as Dark Souls 1. He is notorious for invading us, and also getting completely wrecked, but his armor is still pretty good, ironically. So how that happens, I am not too sure. But, what it could imply that he is a Longfinger, that could imply that his reach is probably slightly better than others. It could imply his age is of great significance and quite unique. It could imply he is an entity of bane towards others. You know, because you know which finger that is. I'll give you a hint. It's not your index finger, nor ring finger. It's the other one. But we do know he also has a history of servitude to those most helpless. As in Dark Souls 1, we've seen him in servitude of the Fair Lady, the sister of Quelaag, who needed humanity to help sustain her life. And in this game, Rosaria. But in general, other than that, not too much is actually known about Longfinger Kirk. Although we do happen to see what is considerably his last of moments, as he sees failure once again in his servitude of his works. And we would find him passed. A most unfortunate fate, to be honest. Ringfinger Leonhardt, who does most of the recruiting, rounding people up, as it were, to the cause of Rosaria. Whether or not he was a newer or older figure to the cause, there really is no proper way to be sure. However, I'm inclined to think it's probably newer, as he had certainly no... It didn't seem to me like he was too otherwise opposed to finishing off Rosaria, stealing her soul and taking it to Anor Londo. But a detail easy to overlook, to misunderstand, as to why he would have done such a thing. And the fact that it went to Anor Londo is a curious one. The fact that he would have targeted a ring sort of leader of the cause of a force that is essentially invading anyone and everyone to keep taking their tongues, and probably hinders the forces of those seeking to the better of causes. I'm sure he probably is actually a spy for Anor Londo, as he uses a crescent moon sword, a sword imbued with the magics of that of the Moonlight Greatsword. Anything to do with moonlight magic is often related to Anor Londo, as that's even the shape of his weapon would very well indicate the collusion that he was perhaps of the crescent moon blades. A very subtle detail, and probably one very easily overlooked by the fingers of Rosaria in the Cathedral of the Deep. In fact, I'm actually quite certain that the Cathedral of the Deep was quite willing to take and accept anyone and everyone to their causes, so long as they would. Even us, and even the Xanthous scholar himself, Heysel. Otherwise, what has me curious about Leonhardt is why the location that we find him would be none other than Guinevere's bedchamber of Anor Londo. Could it be that he wanted some kind of appeasement to the gods at some kind of location of importance to them? Could it be that perhaps he thought he could save the previous gods, as when we possess Rosaria's soul back from him in our encounter with him, we find that we can use one of this holiest miracles that's once related to that of the gods. It could even mean, for that matter, that perhaps he wanted her to be there, or even perhaps believed she was someone else. Whichever of these was the correct call, the correct reason, we might not ever be too sure, as there is no further defining sort of characteristics of this encounter that we've so far recognized. But one of the most peculiar characters of all, and one I think has the most considerable relevance that could be easily ignored, Yellowfinger Heysel. In fact, that Gru's shroud almost half reminds me of his. It's an interesting thing. I try not to think that it is quite related without me really looking that over. But one of the locations in which Yellowfinger Heysel invades us is actually just down there, really close by to this interestingly placed hole in the wall that also has the atonement miracle at it, which is a miracle of Londor that is given to the exiles to more so enforce them in their exilement to be seen and stalked basically more easily by enemies, which has some possibilities of implications. But another interesting detail is just down this way is a sort of little cave, and inside the cave is a scroll of gold and sorceries. Now, a scroll of gold and sorceries entails of that of the Xanthous. The Xanthous. For those unaware, it means something like yellowy gold. Really, really bright, really luminescent. That is what Xanthous stands for. So that should simplify what the Xanthous is very about. And Xanthous also in ties as far back as Irithyll, before it was destroyed by a growing abyss. The abyss wrought by the events of Manus. The very same events that made our boy Artorias infamous. Interesting to know, right? Well, it gets more interesting, let me tell you. So, throughout Dark Souls series, the Xanthous set has always been in a location of availability that implies it was frowned upon in some way or form. In Dark Souls 1, we find someone using it in the painted world of Ariamis. This painted world of Ariamis, of course we know of it as the painted world of Ariandel today for this current game, but it is a place for the forlorn, those who no longer bear a place of belonging to the world. And so, why would it no longer be there? Well, I actually have an interesting idea as to why. Take a careful look at that. Blood. There's always been blood on this headpiece. In all three games, the same relative area. The area that is basically just surrounding the very head of the body. Now, because it is of Oolacile, and quite consistent to be the case of this headpiece, I'm actually quite certain that it is more than likely in some kind of conflict of events that brought out the current scenario, or what was the scenario that was to be dealt with of Manus. And I think that's one of two things. And I have reasons to better support this theory. So the Xanthous, of course, their choice of style was considered ridiculous and foolish, but a lot of what they did was considered ridiculous and or foolish, as they literally had yellow attire that glowed. And not only that, in 1 and 2, the Xanthous crown itself used to be actually quite tall. And I actually have a really solid idea as to why it's so different here in Dark Souls 3. The Xanthous set, the attire, it was very recognized. It was too recognized. It was too recognized for those who didn't want it to be recognized. And in turn, it was more trouble when it was recognized. But let's talk briefly about where we find it in Dark Souls 2. We find it through the Pilgrims of the Dark Covenant, which I cannot be any further convinced that they're anything less than the Pilgrims of Londo, people obsessed with the dark of the abyss, and making sort of amends with that to their ideas of the future and the world with it all. There's literally no convincing me it's not the case. But for some reason, they offer this headpiece, which could imply not only was it too out of place even for the forlorn in some way, but it went to becoming a thing of those of Londo and the Abyss, the people of Dark, that stemmed of humanity. And I think here in Dark Souls 3, we see the next conclusion of it, where it gets exiled from that selection of people and into the Cathedral of the Deep. And so, every single generation, it got seen as more and more, in some ways, ridiculous and outcasted by the rest. And so this time, they got outcasted by those of the Dark of the Abyss, and taken in by those of the Deep, and of Rosaria. We know this much, as it still clarifies with Heysel's own pick, his own weapon, that he was in fact the Xanthous scholar. He must have seen quite a while's worth of whatever of the world, of generations, of people coming and going, and of loss of his acceptance. As for what he truly aimed for, this much I'm not actually too sure. I think what he truly aimed for was acceptance, which I think could imply those of the Xanthous did something. They were foolish enough to, and have done something wrong, and were never forgiven and accepted for it. And Heysel himself was still considered quite foolish, even to that of Ringfinger Leonhardt. Leonhardt himself tells us Heysel is a fool, as he tries some kind of trying to be too chummy and buddy in some kind of romantic way with ideas with the fingers of Rosaria. And so, I think, all in all, the Xanthous were responsible for a certain downfall that was the great event of Manus corrupting Irithyll, and were well recognized for it. And in turn they were rejected by many, and not just because of their ridiculous attire, but because all their decision making was just that foolish. And in turn, even every single step they made just got worse and worse for them. And I think it must have looked something like they believed so strongly that they were much more and close and powerful than any sort of dark could have been with their light magic, that they would simply taunt and see if they could intimidate and overpower a truer artifact and being of the abyss, that they would have just wrought out an outright horror of destruction on themselves as a result, and that they would in turn never show their faces again in any more ordinary of fashion. And in turn, that gave me two ideas as to what caused this sort of blood mark. Either one, in their failed attempt, they got injured in the process, or simply two, because in the case of Manus, those being corrupted by it, well, their heads kind of bloated into a more exploded sort of skull fracturings, and their brain became part of their new hardened physiology. Perhaps they too thought they could suppress this kind of issue by simply wrapping their heads up enough and maybe enshrouding themselves even more firmly in light magic attire, that perhaps they could suppress such horrible things from occurring to them at all. If they were foolish enough to do a number of things, then they could have been foolish enough to do that as well. And maybe even think that they could suppress Manus, suppress his dark at the start. And as we've seen it, the people of Irithyll were not completely incompetent, as some have traveled from Irithyll into the Ringed City with their artifacts of home and had been entrusted with the weapon of Midir as a sort of champion-like figure, and safeguarded as the last recorded spear of the Church of I wonder if it was probably a matter of an order of operations. That perhaps first those of Irithyll went to there, and then Manus returned to deliver the remark, the information that it is in fact the case. I really do believe a number of things could have happened in that kind of style of regard. Now, I do think it happened of that kind of nature, but it's not too well defined in any of the games, to be honest. But we do have some pretty interesting small details to kind of build off of that. But moving on to Heysel himself. Heysel leaving those of Londo, and I do believe he is in fact one of those in leaving of Londo specifically. Not just because of this right here, and not just because that he had invaded right over here in close proximity to all this, but not too far away, just over that way. We also have been invaded by another figure, the Pale Shade of Londo. In fact, I don't think that part is a coincidence at all. I'm actually pretty convinced that it must be a connection to this over here. That they would have traversed this way, trying to escape and be less and less apparent. In desperation to become less apparent, they had flattened the top of their hat, their headpiece. They had dirtied and dulled the light magic that was once of their fabrics and attire. They'd done literally everything they could to become seen less, to become less obvious and observant. And in turn they came up with whatever, just to shrug off the change of their style. But not only was that the case that they had changed in this mannerism, Yellowfinger Heysel himself, in service of Rosaria, would also be in possession of the Obscuring Ring because of his covenant alliance and servitude, which was one of the final steps he needed to better enshroud himself from long distances. But of course, up close, he was still quite easily noticeable. But being of Irithyll, he was still also one of skills that is of Irithyll's light magic, such as that of camouflage, or I should say chameleon, as this game calls it. The same spell that was used by a pilgrim of Londo, as we see following Henri in Irithyll. Now you're probably really making the connections. Okay, there's got to actually be a little more to this. But I don't know about all of these details. But certainly some of this is actually quite adding up a little too much. That it can't actually be a coincidence. Because the chameleon spell, though, is a sorcery unique to Irithyll, to the Xanthous, because of their knowledges of light magic, and even their scroll that we take off of a body here and bring back to Orbeck. I don't think this is a coincidence at all, and actually, more than likely, our beloved Heysel's story. I think that is why we find him where we find him. And then just over there is the direction of the other place, towards the Cathedral of the Deep, in that upper less poisonous swamp with the crabs. In turn, it's a little more home turf for him. As well as maybe a bit of this, it makes sense for both to be considerably home turf for him, as he does kind of invade us here and there. Which is actually quite interesting as a detail, because not too often in these games does someone invade you so frequently and in such close proximities. But another quick little slight mention I should make is the significance of what is the fingers of Rosaria to that of the Darkmoon blades. The Darkmoon blades do not support the fingers of Rosaria at all. In fact, if you actually start doing anything relatively in service to Rosaria, like, you'll basically fail the Ceres quest. The NPC of the Darkmoon blades, of their last known knight to us, which is an interesting detail in my opinion, and would imply that basically, obviously, they're just straight up against anything to do with the Cathedral of the Deep and the favor of Rosaria, which once again supports the idea that Ringfinger Leonhardt could have very well been of the Darkmoon blades of service. We otherwise have nothing else to kind of lead us on about what he was truly after. But one thing we can semi-trust into is our beloved friend here, Patches the Unbreakable, I should mention. And what is very interesting about him that we can trust, that is of extra significance here. In fact, you probably thought I was done over this way. So it's like, why did he return this way? Well, we see Patches in another place or two in this game. In this game, we do find him also at the Firelink Shrine, as he thinks he's caught himself a cleric striving to become another Firekeeper, in which I think, if they're in any support of the Way of White, he particularly won't let them get that kind of far in their progression as a Firekeeper. I think that is part of what he actually would do. But besides that, here at the Cathedral of the Deep, now you recall I said he happens around over there and then to over there, right? Interestingly, another thing happens to be placed here at the Cathedral of the Deep, an item we kind of revisit, and there is a third place we happen along Patches. Not here at the Cathedral of the Deep, not here at the, not there at the Firekeep Shrine, or Firelink Shrine. But we happen to find him in the Ring City DLC in the Dragged Heap. Now, the significance of this For starters, he comes to us as an amnesiac by the name of Lap. He won't know how he came to be this way. He recalls, though, that he is in fact unbreakable. And something else we see, besides his absurdly weighty armor, is a peculiar shield, the Curse Ward Great Shield, to be more specific. Great Shield given to those who resisted the curse long ago. Far too heavy for an ordinary person. Perhaps it signifies the foolishness of resisting the curse. And yet, those who bear the weight to this shield will not find its protections against curses wanting. These are very interesting details to be mentioned. One, why would they find the protections against curses wanting, bearing the weight of the shield? Is it just not effective? Is it foolish to try to even consider it being used to fight your curse? Well, let's talk about the curse in general. Now, there's two aspects of the curse. There's the hollowing aspect of the curse, and there's curse of, say, getting cursed by a basilisk, where you get pretty much petrified. Now, this actually pertains to the, I'm pretty sure, the petrification aspect. And so it's probably really not a very good match for one trying to fight the hollowing aspect. And I think that was considered a lost knowledge brought by that of what used to be the world of Dark Souls 2, where we initially seen this shield being carried by the Pursuer Knights, who hunted peculiar of undead. In that world of the Dark Souls 2, though, in Howling and Curse, that worked a little bit differently. Curse wasn't simply petrification in Dark Souls 2. You essentially just permanently kept losing amounts of your health also. In, like, your state of being hollowed, in fact. It was certainly a way to go, that's for sure. It certainly made for an interesting way to deal with the final boss in Dark Souls 2, which literally created orbs that cursed you. But what we know about Lap is that we know he considered himself hollow, and that he was continuously affected by it, becoming more and more affected by it by the day, as he was losing more and more of his memories, what he was like, what he did, who he knew, and so on. One thing he did know for sure, and that was that he was unbreakable. Taking that to heart, he probably took that a little more literally, and would wear quite a weighty armor as a result. Another aspect of him in that timeline, we see he is quite considerably much more giving than before, which is probably the most curious detail of all, to be honest. It makes you wonder how it got to be that way. Here is our good old friend, a good old petty thief. His name is Grey Rat. The thing about Grey Rat is that he has a sort of motto for himself for how he wants to live the current rest of his life. He realizes he's lived his life as a rat, but he would rather not die like one. He would rather not die known as a rat. That is what Grey Rat is about. And something interesting about Grey Rat is that our good buddy boy Patches also greatly respects him. Something that is almost unheard of Patches. To actually respect and even consider himself willing to go out of the way for such a person.
The slinking rodent. But he did me a good turn back in Lothric Dungeon. Doubtless I should do something about that little dead. Well, maybe not. Well, I can hardly believe he's still standing. Can't find anything? Oh, you could.
In Dark Souls 1, it was actually uncommon for Patches to have such pleasant things to say about people. In fact, he would always tell you of all the little cautions to always make of others in Dark Souls 1. And in turn, he was actually quite a useful character if you did keep him alive, if you took him in and whatnot. The fact that he has no sort of cautions about Grey Rats and would even want to settle his debts for him is a very interesting thing, actually. And for another peculiar sort of reasoning to me. Do you recognize this place? Take it in real carefully. Now, some of you keen eyes know immediately it's Lothric Castle. And in fact, you probably know too familiarly, that this is where we in fact found Grey Rats first sitting and rotting in a jail cell. Yep, it's certainly where we found him, alright. There's no way anyone could mistaken this for anywhere else, right? I mean, we have the stairs here, we have these, bit of like a barrier and the pillars and a bit of like a roofing here. Bit of like wall structure as well. As well as a bit more platform. Some furniture. Let's see, if we look around, what else is around us? Kind of by the actual main buildings pretty well, but just above is like the tower stuff and whatnot. Otherwise, if we look over here, it's like some of the more house-looking buildings and such, which I think was used for like semi-residential or more general sort of like guard stations. We got this nice sort of walkway here, and this sort of door we can't really go through for some reason. Have a lantern there, some furniture. There's shields on the wall and some daggers and weapons. Yeah, it's just sort of... There's really no way to mistake this for someplace else, right? Meanwhile, there really isn't any way to recognize this with any place that I can tell. It's like, what would have gone up here? Barricades or what? We have our bonfire here. We have a door that sees like no kind of use. Bookshelf. A rack full of dishes. And I guess of cloth. There's like a doorway here, but can't really use it at the moment. But it's looking a little more dependable than that door, I guess. Sort of sheet here. Feels like there must have been other things in here at some point, but I wonder what. So much wreckage, it must have seen quite a lot going through it and things happening to it. Some kind of like a roofed archway and some stairs. I wonder where this... Well, if there's like stuff like this here, I'm sure it probably mirrored on the other side. It looks like the roofing was collapsed. Where all it went. Probably like right here, to be honest. Or maybe like somewhere else. Not too sure. There's like someone to walkway, a dead person. Did you do this? I can target you. That's probably not important though. It looks like there would have been more walkway going around this. And like a bit of a wall maybe? I wonder if this at all lets you go somewhere actually over here, or if this just sort of happened this way. Probably no real way to tell that, but oh, it's a Lothric tower. Like it's a lot like one of the ones we had like a bonfire at even. Although I think the bonfire would have been like right down there, and we would have came from just inside of that. Or maybe this could be like that one where we got ambushed at. Where there was like a... No, this would have probably been more like the one we started off at, right? I feel like the one we got ambushed at had just slightly more cover for like the person that rushed out at us, but if we like charged the guy that was sitting at that ledge. I'm sure that's right? Right? That has to be the case. Where that bridge was to. I actually don't remember a bridge like that. Have I ever seen a bridge like that somewhere? Like that small and thin? Otherwise, that would have been like one of those areas just full of common enemies, like hollows and such. And you would have been able to go down there into the underside of like the tower. Otherwise, this doesn't seem to be like the tower that had that one statue at it. It's like, I wonder how much this has shifted from its original towering. Am I overweight? That's crazy. Absolutely insane. Is this actually a towering right here? Is that like that before? I'm actually not too sure. I don't think so. That could be like a clue of how much movement actually happened, to be honest. Or actually, I remember. This was the place where we found Grey Rat, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. We came down these steps, and surely enough, little building that had Grey Rats in his little prison cell rotting is no longer here. I wonder where that went. I'm actually honestly not too sure about that archway. To be honest, I really don't. Wait, maybe that was like one of those higher up archways you couldn't normally get to. That would make sense. I was just thinking, I don't think that's a normal bridge, actually. But, yeah, I don't know what kind of significance this would be. Well, actually, I can explain this one. I can actually explain all of this. So this old lady, I'll give you a hint. If you still have like the ashes for her and inspect it, it's not the easiest to see, but on the fingers is a ring, and on the ring closest resembles this icon for this ring, which would imply who she could have been, which would be none other than our shrine handmaiden, our friendly, soul-thirsty merchant. And in fact, one of our interactions with this one was none other than, "I have business with you." And she thought that was quite strange. And certainly enough, still had purchase options. And not only that, she knew Patches, but she called him a tin can because of his sort of shift from going from leather to heavy armor. And now you're probably getting kind of interested. But that's how she knew him, and that's how she lasted. They both came from the Firelink Shrine. They both left it for some reason. Perhaps it was no longer sustainable for any reasonable purposes. especially for salvaging, for scavenging, and what else? But I have reason to believe they returned here specially because of Patches. Patches trying to find himself, remember himself. And in the process, he remembered this way was somehow important to something. And what he remembered was Grey Rat. He remembered he wanted nothing less than something great for Grey Rat. And this is really probably hitting a few of you, knowing how much of an actual kind of a good heart of a character Patches actually had. In this DLC's content, we go through the Ringed City with Patches, knowing him as Lap. Not only that, he tells us a few things, that he is hollow, and that even the... what are they called again? I am rusty with names of things. The Purging Stones. That even those items, used to reduce undead curse buildup and cures hollowing, aren't even working for him anymore neither. And that he was in turn seeking the Purging Monument, so he could find out who he was, what he did, what he lived for. And when he did, he told us. He didn't have otherworldly desires like other people. He was completely without it. And he wasn't too sure why he is the way he is. That he would always couldn't help himself but to just chuck someone off a ledge, perhaps, and watch them fall. That he would be disgusted with the ambitions of someone seeking treasure and want them to never get it. This is Patches. In the end, he was completely without anyone to keep punishing for their greed. That he was losing himself. Realizing he was losing himself, he looked for any options viable to undo what kind of damage it seemed to be doing to him. In turn, he came to the conclusion that it was all curse. One big curse. And in turn, he would try everything and anything in his power to resist it, to undo the damage it was upon him, to keep his memories, remember who he was, and prove he was in fact our boy, the unbreakable Patches. He even sought a shield so heavy it was next to useless to pursue. and yet it was also a shield of significant defenses to curse. And quite noticeably, I'm realizing it also has pretty significant guard absorptions. Like, wow. Although, I guess I probably don't really pay much attention to shields, to be honest. So I guess to me, any shield that has apparently 100 physical absorption is pretty nice. So I guess my opinion doesn't matter right there. But the fact that that shield was there in the Cathedral of the Deep, nearby where Patches's was, it really says a lot about what he had become, and also a bit of what he truly strived for and clung on to even to the end of the world. And I think it even made him like a better person to an extent that he would be also giving enough to even change the greedy soul's hungry nature of the shrine maiden there also. That perhaps he would provide her the things that he used to collect and even sell. His rusted coins, if you recall her shop selection. But I believe I have the real solution as to why Patches was there at the Cathedral of the Deep. I believe he was there for business.
Oh, hello, Gary.
And what is this business there? Boom. The red bug pellets. Why do I say this? Medicinal pellets made from crushed insects. The red type temporarily boosts fire damage absorption. Prepared in the Cathedral of the Deep by evangelists who dole them out to followers to ease their suffering when they burn. He sells these, of all things, in quite high in supply for that matter, which could imply he just gets a ton of them somewhere. And I do believe that is part of his business there. And let me tell you a subtle detail about the Cathedral of the Deep. Things there don't like fire. Those little sludge things that I'm pretty sure are made from Aldrich, those don't like fire. Those grub monsters, those don't like fire. Just a lot of things there at the Cathedral of the Deep don't like fire. The fact that there's enemies there that set themselves aflame is quite remarkable, because things there just don't like fire. And I think it's a very good sort of explanatory feature about the Cathedral of the Deep that tells us about their sense of practices that relate to that of just outright suffering. Suffering as a practice, whether you're part of the cathedral or not. I think it is practically a guarantee that suffering is in order. Now, if you still didn't believe me that it was in fact a thing about the Cathedral of the Deep, literally over here, we find an interesting little item exampling further the notched whip. The cleansing chapel uses whips such as these in order to produce the drops and puddles to wipe clean during its rituals. The shackles of bondage lie deep in the hearts of all humankind. The enshackling forces to be tortured and punished. It is in fact a thing of the Cathedral of the Deep, in that they would even have tendencies to ritualistically bleed out people. And that is so well known for their people to do such that we find another peculiar detail here. A certain slave knight who is on a quest for blood of the dark soul. A quest for blood. And he came to a place where people seek suffering so much that they would just willingly bleed each other out. Should tell you a lot right there, doesn't it? Now, one detail I'm not too certain of is if the activities of Slave Knight Gale originated in Anor Londo, Irithyll, here in the Cathedral of the Deep, or somewhere else, as he is originally on the sort of quest for the better of his painted world, more specifically, his young painter, to make a new goodly home for someone. There aren't too many clear distinctions as to where this truly could have begun with them, but something we can entrust to be the case is that not too far from here we do in fact find traces of the storytellers to the painted world for selling their ways of a home for the forlorn. They themselves are forlorn and want to reach out to the others. However, the storytellers honestly are a little everywhere, but a little more common along the path of sacrifices. This could be that they are trying to catch possible people seeking to reach a better conclusion for their nature as not belonging with the world into a more proper home for them. It is quite possible that is the truer nature of their operations, and that is where they would station. Though we also would see some at the Grand Archives of Lothric Castle. And we would also see a sort of more... well, he basically has red eyes, basically, at Irithyll. there was a grave there, and he was mourning. And irregularly, he has the red eyes, which I believe are those of eyes of those kind of turned by the abyss upon seeing Pontiff Sullivan. Like looking into his eyes and the profane flame. I do believe that is the relativity of that as a topic. And in turn, that would be a subtle way of spreading it into that of even the Abyss Watchers, where they would come to even fight each other. But moving on. But I believe there is a certain kind of like a cycle of what goes on in this place. Those of certain nature who were supposedly, I don't know if it's like they passed their cleansing or didn't. But in one of the conclusions, they come out like this. And in this one, the conclusion, they have that can become of them, which is a sort of grubbed monster thing coming through them. Now, you probably remember grubs aren't actually too unusual here. In fact, there is another mannerism in which they happen like that. These sort of grub things crawling down there. That is their next stage of being. And I believe they have an even further stage of being. And that is the grubmen that serve Rosaria. And in turn, of the non-participants of that, who follow closely with the sort of monks here, are these grave wardens, who are to simply clear out the bodies that there are too many of just appearing and laying around of. And that was rude. Bad. And it really does paint a bit more of this place into a perspective of becoming and events. I believe once they become grubmen, they have two options before them. Continue as grubmen and seeking pale tongues from victims of their choosing. Or after they acquire enough of the pale tongues, they can return to a more human-like state as the deacons. That is what I believe really happens here at the Cathedral of the Deep. And there really isn't anything that heavily supports this nor supports against this. It's just really a bit more of a suspicion of mine. That comes into a number of interesting topics as we look more and more into this place. Especially as you see the different kinds of things that lurk here, that serve here. The deacons that take different shapes and sizes, for that matter. Like, we see some that are taller, we see some that are like chunkier, and also kind of like tankier, I guess. And then of all things, we find those absolute hulks, the Cathedral Knights. To me, those are the most curious things here. But in general, it wouldn't be the first time in the Dark Souls series something absolutely beast-like of a man just is a figure of faith and of servitude of other things in the most blind of fashion imaginable. In Dark Souls 2, there is also a knight so blind in faith that he would serve regardless. That would be Velstad. But that is also irrelevant to this as a topic. Now, the thing about these Cathedral Knights is that they serve to protect those of the deep, the creatures of the deep. So I believe that would mean like these grub men, I believe that would mean these sludge piles, and I believe that would mean outreach. I believe those are the three things that they particularly protect. Or at least, most mainly. There is the curious nature of the few of these guys we see at Lothric Castle, at the proximity of Osiris, and the way to him. There's that toxic sort of grounded garden there. Now, by all means, there are actually a few of these sludges there. But there's also those, just a straight up collection of those pus of men. Where it's like the hollows where they have like the explosion of whatever coming out of them. Where it looks like some kind of freaky snake thing inspired by like Princess Mononoke or something. That's honestly what it reminds me of. Like when the boars become like demons. It really does like remind me of that, and I think it is actually half inspired by it, to be honest. As for which of those they protect, we really can't know, but I'm still thinking it's the sludges. Because I think the sludges themselves only show up at places Aldrich himself had appeared at. Like they would have came from his body. But that does make some interesting questions and implications. Like, one question is, but we find like cinderic ones at the demon ruins. What about those? Well, we also find a pyromancy tome here, if I'm recalling correctly. This, I'm pretty sure we had a pyromancy tome here. But between this place and Carthus, their practices are not always the most orthodox. Then the giants here, well, they simply serve to protect the holy figures here, which they most certainly have, as one defended against those who would get sent down here by their unfortunate circumstances that are not to the will of those willing to let them directly across to Rosaria's chamber, or in general further into the cathedral. And then we have this one here defending the way to Aldrich and also to Rosaria's bedchamber. So yeah, it really kind of puts a perspective of how much giants really are of like a defense of this sort of thing. But only one last sort of honorable mention. When it comes to the Cathedral of the Deep, we have the Evangelists. These are the recruiters to the Cathedral of the Deep. Recruiters to serve, recruiters to be sacrificed. And of those sacrificed, they would prepare things like to be eaten or straight up ready to burn themselves alive. These would come along as the more common of hollows that we have seen guarding like the outside along with the grave wardens, where we also see like the heavier like axe bearing like monks and that. Ladies and gentlemen, you too can be ready for church, or more specifically, for the Cathedral of the Deep, when it comes to what you need to know of if you want to, I guess, not exactly survive it, but more so partake in it. Like, they have sermons, they have, I hear the chips are good. You know, probably don't actually like eat it in the middle of like a ritual or something, but it's good. Trust me. But this would be the more so public location for simple sermons and smaller of rituals to take place. Then, of course, for the more important of them, ones held by Aldrich himself, would take place where we fought the Deacons of the Deep. Which makes absolutely perfect sense that he would be running it and not someone else. Otherwise, it seems to me the seating selection is actually a little bit similar, which tells me they didn't expect too much more or less. And we can probably have to deduce what the maximum amounts of actual crew here they have to work with trying to find seats for by just counting all these chairs. We know they won't have any further than that besides whoever's hosting this and maybe Aldrich also. Well, I guess there's probably going to be some people standing on the sidelines, right? Like maybe a grave warden, like dragging someone up there, maybe someone just like going at him with the whip. I could see it happening. And they would discuss the grave offenses of that of human nature and its desires of suffering and whatnot. You know, I could just see a lot of stuff like that going on, and using sort of example and as a means of cleaning state. So yeah. And don't forget to find a good sort of church attire to go with them with. Or I guess, don't you usually have to like take your hat off or something for church? I don't know, I haven't really been to church before. I'll probably just stick to my helmet. But thank you so much for watching. I hope you all learned something. I hope you maybe even had a few laughs. But until then, you have yourselves a great day. Bye-bye.